Listen up, beautiful nerds. Imagine dying from a disease, being buried by your family, only for them to dig you back up years later because they believe you're coming back from the grave to feed on them. Two young women died from tuberculosis. Years later, they would both be accused of becoming vampires. Last week, we looked at why tuberculosis fueled the New England vampire panic. Today, we're zooming in on two of the most famous cases. For anyone that missed, tuberculosis, the last episode, is caused by a bacterium called Mycobacterium tuberculosis that mainly affects the lungs and spreads through the air. Back then, people knew the disease as consumption, but they didn't know what caused it. So, when one family member died and another started wasting away, some believed the dead were somehow feeding on the living. Here's what happened, nerds. Our first story begins in Manchester, Vermont. On March 8, 1789, Captain Isaac Burton he was a respected church deacon, and he married Rachel Harris. The couple had barely begun their life together. Less than a year after they exchanged vows, Rachel became sick with what people called consumption. Again, we know that today that's tuberculosis. Rachel unfortunately died on February 1st, 1790, and she was only 21 years old, nerds. Only 21. That's so sad. A year later, Captain Isaac tried to move forward with his life, so he married his second wife, Huldah Powell. And they got married on January 4th, 1791. But before long, Huldah also began showing signs of consumption. She also became sick. Her condition continued getting worse. By now, Rachel, the first wife, had been buried for nearly 3 years, and then rumors started in the town. People believed that Rachel didn't truly stay in her grave at night. No, they believed she was returning from the dead to feed on Huldah's life little by little, and that's why Huldah had consumption now too. According to historical accounts, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people reportedly gathered to witness what happened next. See, Rachel's grave was opened, and what remained of her heart, lungs, and liver were removed. They were carried to a blacksmith shop, and there they were burned into ashes. Now, I have a question for you guys. Would you be annoyed or upset if this was done to your body after you were buried? Because people believe that destroying these organs would destroy the vampire and save Huldah's life. But it didn't, nerds. And on September 6, 1793, Huldah unfortunately also died from consumption. Almost 100 years later, history seemed to repeat itself, this time in Exeter, Rhode Island. See, George Brown and his lovely wife, Mary Elisa, had 6 beautiful children. I'm only naming 3 because they're part of the story. I apologize. Among them were Mary Olive, such a pretty name, Edwin, and Mercy Lena Brown. Now, the nightmare for this family unfortunately began on December 8, 1883, when Mary Elisa, the mother, died from consumption. She was only 36 years old. That is so sad. Then, 6 months after that, the oldest daughter, Mary Olive, also dies from consumption. That is so devastating. Years pass, and now Edwin, who is the only son from the children, also starts showing signs of consumption. That is so scary. Friends of Edwin encouraged him to travel to Colorado Springs because some people believed at the time that the dry mountain air could help people suffering from consumption. So Edwin left. He was like, bye. He left Rhode Island with his wife, hoping that his health would improve. Now, while he was away, unfortunately, his younger sister, Mercy Lena Brown, developed a fast-moving form of tuberculosis known as galloping consumption. Within only a few months, Mercy also died at only 19 years old. When Edwin returned home, his own condition became much worse. Now, think about what the family had experienced. I mean, first, the mother dies of consumption at only 36. 6 months pass by. Now, Mary Olive, the oldest daughter, also dies of consumption. Years pass, then Mercy Lena dies of consumption. Now, it seems like Edwin, who is the only boy, is also maybe dying from consumption. See, to us, from our perspective, tuberculosis was spreading through the family, but back then they didn't understand this, and they believed that someone was feeding on the living. So the community began pressuring George Brown, the father, to open the graves. George didn't believe in the old vampire stories, neither did Dr. Harold Metcalf, who was the physician that got to examine the bodies. The doctor believed the entire idea was pointless, but the pressure continued on George, and he gave in because he wanted to help his son Edwin. So, the graves of his wife, Mary Elisa, and his daughters, Mary Olive and Nancy, were opened. Now, keep timeline in mind, because Mary Elisa had been buried for years, so only her skeleton remained. That makes sense, right? Mary Olive had also decomposed. But Mercy had only been buried for about 9 weeks. 9 weeks. It was winter. Ground was cold. Her body was still well preserved. When Dr. Metcalf examined Mercy, he reported nothing unusual. He's like, okay, cool. Her body's decomposing naturally. Nothing to see. But when he removed her heart and liver, blood dripped from the organs. Now, again, to the doctor, that was extremely normal. That was expected to happen. But to many people watching, nerds, it was proof. It was proof that Mercy was still feeding on the living. So basically, the doctor was like, okay, cool, this is normal. And the villagers were like, vampire! Her heart and liver were removed and burned to ashes. And it was prepared as a remedy for Edwin. Does that sound familiar? People believed, again, that destroying the vampire would save his life. But you already know how that goes, nerds. It didn't. Unfortunately, it didn't. And on May 2nd, 1892, Edwin Brown also died from consumption. What's interesting is that the newspaper covering Mercy Brown's exhumation didn't use the word vampire, but other Rhode Island newspapers describing similar exhumations did. Rachel Harris Burton and Mercy Brown, 2 young women who unfortunately died from tuberculosis, or as they would say, consumption, and later became victims of one of New England's most fascinating, tragic, and folk belief, or is it folklore? Thank you for watching, my lovely friends. I am Glory from Archives of the Century. Stay safe, stay weird, stay curious. I'll see you in the archives, my historian friends.